Hello, everyone. I'm Melanie Hardin, and we are coming to you today with an economic analysis of all sports replay, a recession-proof firm. Maybe we'll find out. I'm here with
Cade Michael.
And Ariston Awitan.
All right, and to start with, we are talking about all sports replay. If we want to quick go into the next slide. So All Sports has been supplying outdoor gear to the Gunnison Valley since 1996. Its current owner is Bray Patton, and he and his father purchased the business in 2017 after he graduated from Western with a degree in business administration. So this is a very unique business. It's split into there's new gear as well as consignment gear, so used gear people can go sell there, as well as a bike, ice skate, and ski and snowboard shops that operate throughout the year. And throughout this presentation, we're going to get to hear from Bray himself. We were able to interview him for this economic analysis, so let's hear Bray on his mission statements.
We're community-oriented, consignment sporting goods store, helping people fuel their outdoor pursuits.
Awesome. So up next, we are going to also continue to hear from Bray in his explanations about his marketing strategy, as well as his community engagement with the Gunnison area. So let's hear from him.
We're pretty much exclusively word of mouth. I do a little bit in the paper. We'll usually do an ad in like the Western Welcome, and then the Summer Visitors Guide. Occasionally we'll do one in the paper now and then. With like a sale, something like that. We've got an ad on Cade. We have Facebook and Instagram, but I'm terrible at those, so we don't use them very much.
Do you ever like hear from word of mouth, like, "Oh, I saw you in the paper"?
No, we rarely see. Like, it's not measurable, but I certainly hear all the time, "Oh yeah, I heard some lifty on the mountain about you guys," or from the visitor center. Yeah.
Do you find that happens like pretty organically, or do you stress any tactics or any strategies in which to bolster or catalyze the word of mouth at all?
It happens pretty organically. Okay. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing from that is that his marketing strategy is a little bit old school. He doesn't really have any measurables into how it impacts his economic status, as well as like no online store, anything like that. Now let's hear about how he actively engages with the Gunnison community.
We pretty much just donate and support nonprofits and like youth groups around Gunnison. We donate a lot to Gunnison Trails every year. Typically close once a year to go to like a Gunnison Trails Trail Day. Try and bring as much of the staff that wants to go to stuff like that. Then we give money to hockey teams and Go Girls, high school mountain bike team.
All right, so Bray and All Sports Replay are highly involved in our local community. Let's learn a little bit more about the economic status of the Gunnison area. So the population of Gunnison County in particular has gone up about 11%. The city of Gunnison, however, has gone up about 13% in just the last year. We have about 6,560 people who live here. And then we also get a seasonal population of around 3,000 students who enroll in Western every year. An economic analysis that I found of the impact that makes was almost just over $40 million that Western impacts the local economy. Another interesting fact about Western students here in the Gunnison area is that they are 70% of the people in the city from 18 to 25 years old. And then household income's around $40,000. That may have increased to about $44,000 in the last year. But with the $40 million economic impact, Western really does bring quite a bit of money into the area. And then overall countywide sales tax has gone up around 10%. And that's really interesting because online sales in particular outpaced clothing stores, specialty shops, which is what All Sports Replay is, as well as marijuana sales categories, which I just found very interesting and may be relevant later for this presentation. And now, All Sports economic status, they generally have a crew of 4 to 6 people right now. They're working about 4 right during this in between season. And they've had this consistent crew in the last 3 years, which is really surprising, especially with all the now hiring signs out there in this area. Let's hear from Bray about his growth.
So over the past 5 years, we're at almost 70% growth. It's essentially almost 20% every year, with 2020 being a little down.
Also, Bray's firm's unique setup also allows them to stay competitive year-round. Let's hear how he does that.
Also, we change with the seasons. So, we're mostly bikes and camping and climbing in the summer, and then mostly skis in the winter. I know a lot of other kind of seasonal-based stores, bike stores in the valley, kind of struggle in the winter because people aren't getting their bikes worked on or looking to buy a new bike in January. So yeah, we have something every year that keeps us busy. Our summers are just as busy as our winters, and our off seasons have been getting shorter and shorter every year. So that's a huge one.
Something that helps them stay competitive year-round, no matter the economic status of the globe or nationally, is that their consignment items are constantly being re-upped, and they average about 40% profit margins on their consignment items. Now let's get a little bit into the breakdown of how consignment works at All Sports. So I'm not going to read the whole graph to you. You can just take a look. Some interesting facts is like the minimum profit that they're ever going to make is going to be $7. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but when you think about how much work actually needs to go into All Sports being able to display your consignment item, is you create an account, they display it, they sell it, they give you a call if it sells or if they're going to donate it later, which will happen about 90 days after it's been put on display, depending on demand. So definitely not losing any money, and they don't have to pay anything to get the supply of the consignment items as they are used clothing and gear. So let's go into what used clothing and gear actually is when it comes to types of goods in the economy. So used goods are actually considered inferior. That means that their demand is going to increase as income decreases versus normal goods, where demand is going to increase as income increases. So that means that because of their unique position, the price increasing, their demand during an economic downturn, such as a recession, inflation, or the pandemic, their demand is going to increase for their consignment goods. As the graph displays, the price is unknown because the consignor is going to create the price that they're going to sell it at. And then now I'm going to turn it over to Ariston, and we're going to talk about some of the trends that we're seeing in consignment and used goods.
Yeah, so taking a step back, looking at kind of the national trends here, there is an organization called ThreadUp, and they're an online consignment / retail store. And they also kind of do some education on the environmental impact of fashion. So looking at fast fashion versus kind of consignment resale. And they conduct reports every year looking at the trends in the industry. They kind of project demand and sales revenue overall, and then compare to other industries and timelines. So resale is actually driving a lot of the growth in, I guess, secondhand clothing. The market right now is about $35 billion. It's set to double to 77 billion. And resale is driving this because people want kind of a more, I guess, curated selection of clothing items rather than like a Goodwill where kind of everything people want and don't want is thrown into the mix. So yeah, it's grown 11 times faster than the retail sector. Secondhand apparel has seen a 58% growth rate in 2021, which was actually the highest in 5 years. And consumers actually wear just about half of their closet. So there's like 36 billion clothing items thrown out every year. And about 95% of those can be recycled. And so there's roughly, ThreadUp estimates 9 billion unused clothing items in these closets to be like resold or donated. And yeah, it's generationally, it is on the rise, buying secondhand and selling secondhand. So 40% of millennials and Gen Z shop secondhand, while only 16% of baby boomers did or do. And in 2016, 45% of consumers were open to buying or have bought secondhand clothing items. And then just in 2020, during the recession, 86% of consumers were open to buying or did buy secondhand clothing. So looking at the pandemic effects and really a recession effect on national consignment, generally people want to earn money and they do that by consigning, and they also want to save money, and they can do that by buying consigned. And during the pandemic, there was an emphasis on what was already in people's closets. People didn't want to, people couldn't really go outside and go shop in physical stores. And while there was online, it kind of started this clean out trend where people looked at their closets, saw what they wanted to wear and wanted to throw out or sell. And so this led to kind of an increased supply and demand actually of resale. So 36 million new sellers in 2020. That's a whole lot more supply just in 1 year. And in 2021, there were 73 million total sellers. And then increased demand as well, 33 million new buyers in 2020. And then in general, 2021, 224 million in that demand category there. And it also kind of shifted the consumer preferences of resale. So sustainability was kind of was already important before, but it was even more kind of important during the pandemic and is on the rise. So 1 in 3 consumers cared more about wearing sustainable apparel after the pandemic. And then same thing with money, they wanted to save. So about 1 in 2 consumers were all about seeking the value of clothing rather than kind of like the name or, saving money. And they also preferred resellable garments over just ones you could throw away. And so, yeah, newfound disdain for waste. More people opposed waste and not just clothing, but wasting money also. So they wanted to save on money as well. And yeah, that's kind of just a look at the national consignment market. I'll turn it over to Cade here now to talk about a little bit more about the analysis of all this.
Sure. So now we're going to get into just sort of a brief look into the supply and the demand and how this model works. And the real cornerstone of the supply side, both Mel and Ariston have sort of already touched on, is that there's 2 avenues of supply. So like I said, the cornerstone, both of all sports and sort of consignment business models in general, it's the existence of these multiple modes of supply. This is also sort of why the essence of all sports might be considered quote unquote recession proof. Take, for example, the recession caused by COVID-19, the 2020 pandemic that Ariston has been touching on. The macroeconomic environment, it was plagued with unprecedented employment, low consumption, low investment, and supply chain shortages among a whole myriad of other symptoms. And businesses suffered both in the short, the intermediate, and the long runs because productivity suffered, supply chain saw disruptions, and so forth. And this is the case for normal goods, right? Normal or new goods is when the supply chain sees disruptions, when there's decreases in productivity and consumption, you see a decrease in supply with normal and new goods. As you see the SAS shift up, the potential output shift back, and the intermediate aggregate supply shift down. But in the case of consigned goods or inferior goods, as Mel told us earlier, recessions can actually often lead to increases in supply, as we saw by some of those statistics that Ariston pointed out. And this is a byproduct of an increase in aggregate demand for these sort of recession-proof or inferior goods. According to the Young Entrepreneurs Forum, resale clothing shop is the 17th most recession-proof business, and they put that in their 2022 list of the top 40 most recession-proof models. But also on this list of the top 40 most recession-proof models are recreation services, exercise gear, apparel products, and service and maintenance models. And all sports sort of maintains this unique positionality within the local markets, as Mel pointed out, because they are one of the few players in all of these listed markets that are all within the top 40 of the most recession-proof. And like Ariston was saying, consignment or the opportunity to consign for those that are providing the goods and the clothing to all sports and other online retailers like ThredUp is the opportunity for income. So as consumption is down with unemployment, there's a decrease in income, there's low investment. People and consumers, they look to bolster their income, and they look for a short, quick stimulus to their income. And how do they do that? Like Ariston said, they sell stuff. By operating in a business model in which a majority of the supply is comprised of used goods, all sports has this sort of self-constructed safety net, if you will. When a supply chain disruption wreaks havoc on new goods, obtaining goods, importing, manufacturing, there's another avenue, there's another stream of supply to maintain merchandise on the shelves, and that's consigners, that's used goods, that's coming from the closets, and that's secondhand things. And further, during these times of recession, consigners are incentivized to, in fact, consign, because it does provide that quick income stimulus. So not only does it provide a secondary stream of supply whenever supply chains are disrupted and whenever supply is down, but the supply is increased often in a recession. So now we'll move into the demand and see how that sort of works in conjunction with this. So when speaking about demand, we're really talking about the relationship between income and inferior goods. There was the slide that Mel noted on earlier in her description of inferior goods, and when you juxtapose them to a normal or even a luxury good on the other end of the spectrum, inferior goods are those goods for which demand has the inverse relationship with income, as Mel pointed out. And as we know, demand for these inferior goods increases as the income level of the consumers decreases. So thus, in a recessionary period, when income levels are often down, inferior goods such as discount groceries and thinner toilet paper, or in the case of all sports, used clothing and used bicycles and used gear, they become more desired. So this is sort of the parallel and also complementary cornerstone of all sports and the consignor business model. And it might be why it's considered at least relatively recession proof. And this is the duality of demand. So the duality of demand sort of, like I said, works in conjunction with that duality of supply. There's both the supply of new goods and the supply of used goods. And similarly, there's a demand for used goods and a demand for new and in trendy technology and new goods. So as we explored in that previous slide, all sports has this positional advantage over competitors because their access to these twin streams of supply, both with the new goods from manufacturers, used goods from consigners, and the same can be said of demand. So while all sports stocks and sells normal goods from camping gear to bike componentry and even disc golf paraphernalia, or luxury goods like some new bicycles or brand new skis and boots that people will buy when incomes are up. Their supply and sale of the inferior or the used goods that we've seen, the consigned goods, that provides that similar, sort of war on two fronts, if you will. As the supply side, in times of recession, all sports sees increases in demand for the majority of their inventory, these used goods that we saw. They comprise the majority of their merchandise in the store. So in times of economic growth, economic prosperity, and success, all sports can similarly meet the demands of the consumer with the new and the more expensive product and the ones that disposable income is willing to be paid for. And then in times of recession, vice versa. And this is sort of one of the advantages of all sports as well is that they're giving the consumer what they want or what they can afford necessarily. So as general marketing thought teaches us, the consumer is always right, and giving the consumer what they truly want is the key to successful business. You know, we saw this with the tubeless tire slime in the 606 marketplace simulation that we were doing, the tricarbon and the Cade and the various teams that invested in that tubeless tire slime. They saw shoots up in their increased demand and in their increased sales because they gave the consumer what they wanted. And in the case of all sports, they've constructed this model that sort of inherently embodies that ideal of giving the consumer what they can afford. So without having to constantly adjust inventory and the sales structure to match current economic conditions like some other models might have to do, all sports replay meets demand with this balance and this counterbalance. You know, that seems to be the key to the consignment model in general. You know, in a recession, used goods cover the basis of new goods problems, where in prosperity, new goods cover the diminished characteristics and the diminished need and the diminished advantages of these used goods. So in essence, all sports provides both the complements and the substitutes to their own products. So next we'll sort of look at a case study or a really good example of how this works in all sports front. And this is bicycles. You know, it seems quite relevant because of our simulation in the marketing class, but also it's just in the outdoor industry. You know, bicycles are such a large and prominent figure and saw so many disruptions during the pandemic. So here we have a few of the logos from our marketing simulation, tricarbon, chapeau, and Cade. But anyway, getting into bicycles, bicycles in general might actually be considered a reasonably inferior good, and that might seem counterintuitive because they're such an expensive good. But you know, in relation to the things that they can serve as substitutes for, like cars, they might be seen as a cheaper alternative. So as real income falls in a recessionary period, demand for bicycles, it often sees surges as a radically cheaper mode of transportation, a radically cheaper mode of commuting, whilst energy and food prices remain high. And because of the supply chain disruptions that occurred during the pandemic and this seen surge in demand for bicycles, you know, as anyone who might have tried to purchase a bike, you know, much less pedals or a bottom bracket or a new group set in the past 3 years, much, you know, even today, I'm sure Alex gets this in particular and has plenty of insight on this with his business. You know, demand for bikes is up, but supply of bikes and supply of bike parts and componentry is down. So as with any manufactured and imported good, as so much of bicycle componentry and bicycle frames are imported, you know, these supply chains for bicycles, they took this massive hit in recent years, and it's been really hard to get a bicycle. It's been really hard to get a brake set. It's been really hard to get a chain. It's been really hard to get a crank set, etc. Yet despite this lack of supply, the demand for these bicycles only increased. You know, we saw this in a lot of the articles that we explored in module 1 when talking about the effects of the pandemic. There was the ones on giant bicycles, there was the ones on Trek trying to sort of take over shops and reinstitute these supply chains, because, you know, demand is up and supply is down. And for bicycle manufacturers and bicycle retailers, this is obviously a problem, is this irreconcilable gap. But there is, in all sports case, you know, this solution to that, this sort of recession-proof model. So we'll hear from the owner here, if Ariston will click on that in the interview.
You kind of asked about supply chain issues with resale and new stuff. New stuff we were hit super hard. It's still hard for us to get certain bike parts. But yeah, consignment carried us through that. 2020 and 2021, we pretty much didn't have a single new bike to sell. But demand for bikes was really high, and we saw a ton of consignment bikes those years. So that absolutely helped us a ton.
Yeah, so as Bree sort of notes there on the side of used and consigned bicycles, he saw sales, and the business saw sales of bicycles and sales of parts. They rose during 20 and 21, despite the decreased supply of new goods. So these these increases in sales is primarily due to consigned and used bikes as opposed to these new ones. And why? Because they're cheaper and there are more of them available. So bicycles in general, as we saw earlier, they might be seen as an inferior good. And if that's the case, then used and cheaper bicycles might be seen as a very inferior good, meaning that the demand for them increases significantly when incomes decrease in a recession. So that's to say, if bicycles are cheap means of transportation when compared to cars or other alternatives, when real income is low, then used or consigned bicycles are even cheaper, and cheaper means of achieving the same outcome of having a bicycle and having a means of commuting and transportation. And so this access to both the new bikes and the old bikes, it harkens back to the unique positionality and the advantages within the various markets that all sports is in that we looked at earlier in the supply and the demand slides. The bicycle example. It's just a great microcosm of all sports positionality, and that sort of places them in this recession-proof area. So when supply of new bicycles is down, retailers like Big Al's up in Crescent Butte or Double Shot down in Gunnison or Tamichi Cyclery, they suffer because they have fewer bikes in supply to meet the increase in demand. However, all sports, they have this safety line, this safety net of supply, that when the supply of new bicycles is up and imports are relatively unaffected, all sports gains similar traction alongside these competitors that we just talked about. But having this duality of both new and used gear, it translates particularly well to the bike industry. Although used bikes are a popular resale item, used bike components tend not to be, and obviously there's no secondhand consigned alternative to servicing and maintenance for a bike. So that being said, all sports not only offers both new and used bicycles and have this dual stream of supply and also duality of demand, but they carry an array of componentry and they offer repair and tuning services. So in short, or in closing, in the bicycle example, all sports matches their competition in the markets that they're in, but they simultaneously offer consumers access to entirely different markets. And they, like we said, sort of at the end of the demand slide, they cover both complements and substitutes to their own goods. And so one of the only issues or one of the only problems that all sports is confronted with is competition. So we'll sort of explore that in the next slide. Competition it's the blatant objective of any successful business. How do you remain competitive within a competitive market? And the obvious or the simple competition for someone like all sports is retail competition. The other brick and mortar stores that sort of mirror some of the business models that all sports emulates. And that can be large retailers such as REI, but it can also be sport and specialty retailers like Epic, Gene Taylor's Bree talks about a little bit, Double Shot, the Alphaneer, Big Al's, the things we talked about in the last slide. But despite recycled good programs such as REI's garage sale that sort of are within the same realm as what all sports does, all sports confronts less competition in the outdoor retail space because of their unique positionality and the way their firm is structured. It's very differentiated from something like an REI or something like an Epic, or even something like a Backcountry. But what Ariston sort of explored in his slides was that he was talking about ThreadUp and the rise in online resale, whether that's Poshmark or Facebook Marketplace or the Pros Closet for bicycles or eBay for collectibles. Online resale is the fastest growing source of secondhand sales. And 70% of consumers say it is easier to shop secondhand now than it was 5 years ago. And that's according to ThreadUp. The consignment business model's success and reliability in the times of recession, it's no secret and it's not unique to all sports. So these online resellers that we mentioned, they offer sellers platforms to list and sell goods as well. And in theory, to larger potential consumer bases, to anyone that can access the internet and you can ship something to, not just, a mountain town consignment shop like all sports might offer. So the primary competition that all sports faces, as Bree notes here that we'll listen to in a second, is online competition and sort of accessibility for the consigners. So we'll hear from Bree himself real quick.
online marketplaces are probably what I'm like most fearful of.
Yeah, so obviously that was a brief explanation, but there's I guess reason to be fearful of these online resellers and online retailers because we've seen this drastic increase in the market for secondhand and consignment goods, and particularly an increase in online versions of that. So that would be the primary concern, the primary issue for all sports, is competition, particularly in the online realm. So these are just sort of suggestions we might have for all sports, and how to maybe adjust their business model, maybe how to adjust their strategies so that they might, confront some of these issues. So additional economic potential with in-depth and marketing analysis. Mel noted that a survey could give them give the firm more insight into marketing potential and further avenues of growth. To combat the issue of competition that we explored in the last slide, an online outlet or a media presence, offering opportunities for consigners to list goods without cutting all sports out of the equation, because that's what a lot of these online competitors do, is it offers a direct consigner to consumer platform, and makes the middleman like in all sports unnecessary. And lastly, a firm and directed marketing approach. As we saw, all sports is pretty old school with their marketing approach, and this word of mouth approach, it's effective in small communities like the Gunnison Crested Butte or the Gunnison Valley. You retain customer loyalty of the small population here, but some degree of marketing, whether it's physical with flyers or digital with a social media presence or an ad campaign, or even event based where you're sponsoring an event and really getting your name out there. All of these can increase visibility, and surely won't hurt all sports business model. And then lastly, just getting into conclusions, there's really no better way to put this than what the owner of All Sports might say himself here.
All sports is a fairly recession-proof business model. When the economy's bad, people are looking to save money and buy used gear versus new. And when the economy's really good, people are buying all the hot new gear and they're bringing their old stuff in here to consign.
Yeah, so that was just a really simply put, sort of tying a bow on what we explored here, and why all sports and consignment stores, like all sports that operate in that business model, they might be considered fairly recession proof, is because they offer so many sort of indisposable products and services. They have bicycle maintenance and repair. They have consigned goods where they have multiple streams of supply and multiple avenues of demand. And they have new goods and the hot, fresh technology whenever economic prosperity is up and disposable income can afford those things. So they don't really suffer quite as much, or they're not quite as exposed or vulnerable to swings in the macroeconomy like a lot of other firms that are hit so hard with supply chain disruptions, et cetera. So is any business model completely or entirely impervious to the swings of the macroeconomy? Not even close. Were any firms completely unaffected by the pandemic in some fashion? Not even close to being close. But does all sports replay's unique position of having these multiple modes of revenue, these multiple modes of supply, from service and maintenance to consigned goods to brand new tech, do these lessen the blows, and do they place all sports in a favorable position should the macroeconomy see a swing in one direction or another, like we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic? Close enough. So that's our presentation on all sports replay and sort of the consigner business model, and why it might be considered recession proof, or at least recession tolerant anyway. So thank you guys so much.